So far, our script has successfully connected to the database and selected the particular database that we want to use, but we haven't got any output from our query apart from the name of the table, which is not very useful. So let's take a look at ways to output some data from the database. What we use, now that we've got our result of our query here, is a function called MySQL fetch row. Now what that does is it returns a numerically indexed array which we can use to access the data. So for a numerically indexed array, if you remember, we could use a loop to go through and access all the elements within the array. However, there are a number of different rows as a result of the query. Each row represents one row within the database. So the way we loop through all the different rows to act on those is we can simply use a while loop. And we'll set a variable, let's say record, to the value of the result of this function, MySQL fetch row, and we're going to do that from the result of the query, so that if this executes successfully, that means that data has been returned and has been assigned to record. If it doesn't work, that means that no data has been assigned to record, and this while loop will stop. So now we've got a record variable containing a row from the results, and we're going to have to loop through that to check every element within the row, so every column within the row, essentially. So let's use a for loop, similar to the ones we've used before. And that's going to go through the length of the number of elements within the result array. And every time it finds one, it's going to echo this element on its own to the browser. And let's put in another line break over here. This is so that the different records will be split up from each other. And finally we finish our while loop with another curly bracket. Let's save that and see what our MySQL fetch row has done for this PHP script. As we can see, the data is being output now. We've successfully used our PHP script to access the data within our database, and it's being output in a rather random way. Well, it's not random, but it's not very structured in terms of how the user is being presented with the data. There are a lot of empty spaces, and although we've got all the data here, we don't know what any of these are. Maybe a little common sense could tell us that this is the email, but one of these two figures is the phone and one of these is the fax, and we're not being told. So that's not very useful. If we go back to our PHP script, there's another more useful way to do this, which involves associative arrays. Now, the change that we need to make here is to use a different PHP function called MySQL fetch assoc, for associative array. Now this, of course, we won't be able to use this for loop, because as we found out in the last chapter, for loops will only work with numerically indexed arrays. So what we'll use is another while loop, and we're going to use that list function that we learned about in the last chapter, the list and each functions, to find the key and the value of each element within the associative array. So we're going to say field name can be the name of the key, and field value can be the name of the value. And we're going to act on the record associative array. This works very similarly to the example in the last chapter. We're going to output to the browser the field name and then concatenation symbol and a quote there, and then we're going to put in simply a colon and a space to separate them, and then the field value. And we shouldn't forget to put in another HTML tag within double quotes as always. And we'll close that in a while loop. So where before we had a for loop within a while loop, here we have two while loops, but it's doing pretty much the same thing. The outer one loops through all the different rows within the result of the query that we specified, while this inner loop here loops through all the elements within the array that we fetched for each row. Let's take a look at how that's working. If we refresh our browser, we'll see that this time it's included the keys. Each of the keys, and where there's a blank field with nothing in it, the key is still specified, so we can see what is missing from there. Phone and fax, it's obvious which one's which, and the data is generally presented in a much more useful way. Once again, I suggest you take the opportunity to have a play around with these new ideas, try out some queries of your own on the sample database or on your own database,